Good morning, everybody. Again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining us. We know it's always a busy time in the charter school world, so we certainly appreciate your commitment and your time to your presentation today. We will be talking about charter school risk management, specifically going over some strategies to reduce the school's liability through risk transfer. This is going to be the first of a series of multiple webinars, so keep on the lookout for upcoming dates as we announce them. And again, feel free to share those links with anybody in your staff or your network that you think may take advantage of this content. We have opened this webinar to, of course, our members and also to non-members. So I'll start by introducing myself and our firm in case there's some of you out there that may not be familiar with who we are and what we do. My name is Mary Cardoso. I am an account manager here at Aegis Insurance and Risk Advisors. We are an insurance agency that was founded in 2008 with a core focus of providing a cost-effective property and casualty insurance program and risk management services to Florida public entities. We have two main avenues. One of those is special taxing districts, and the other one is public charter schools. We've actually grown to be the leading agency providing insurance solutions for charter schools. Today, we insure more than any other agency in the state, and there's actually not another agency that has a specialty in charter schools. Our approach is intended to be consultative and personalized. And by that, I mean that we try to establish an open communication channel with our members throughout the year. We try to be available and be a resource all year round and not just at renewal. We go out and try to educate our members in their risks and their exposures to loss and how to mitigate those. And we also try to make the insurance process as simple as possible, because we know it can be cumbersome and you have a lot on your plate. So we try to take off from that plate as much as we can. So that's us, that's Aegis. Now Ryan is going to introduce you a little bit to Florida Insurance Alliance, or Trust, which is the other logo that you see on your screen and our screen that you may not be as familiar with, and he'll kick off our presentation. Ryan.
Thanks, Ms. Mary. My name is Ryan Roopner, and I'm the manager of loss control services here at FIA. For those who may not be familiar with FIA or the Florida Insurance Alliance, we are a governmental self-insurance trust that provides insurance coverage to over 900 public entities within the state of Florida. That does include about 220 public charter schools. In addition to just providing insurance coverage, we also provide risk management services. One example is trainings and webinars like we are putting on today. We also conduct site visits to each of our campuses to help support their risk management efforts. We understand, over the years in dealing with this many charter schools, that you guys don't necessarily have a risk management department or a full-time risk manager, and we'd like to kind of step in and be an extension of your risk management department. We've worked with a lot of schools, we've seen a lot of claims, we've done a lot of visits, and the goal for us really is just to share some of those best practices and lessons learned with you guys, and we'll actually be sharing some of those today as we go through this presentation. So as you guys know, the topic today is risk transfer, so I'll dive a little bit deeper into what that actually is and why it's important. We'll start off by talking about hold harmless and indemnification provisions in contracts, as well as certificates of insurance, additional insured status, and we'll have an opportunity before we conclude to answer some of your questions. In the Zoom, you do have an option to submit questions, so feel free to do so as we go through the slides today. Before we move forward, I'm just going to turn off my camera real quick so we can save some space on the screen, and I'll get back on before we finish. So to kick things off, before I answer the question of what is risk transfer, I just wanted to briefly talk about some of the options you have as far as managing risk at your charter school. So my personal favorite, if we look at the picture on the right-hand side here, is the avoidance method. But as we know, it's almost impossible to avoid certain risks when it comes to successfully running a charter school. That leaves us with a few more options. We can accept it and maybe do nothing, just kind of go with it, or we can reduce it or transfer it. So the transfer piece is going to be the focus of today's presentation, and ideally it's part of your overall risk management program or strategy. As with all things in risk management, it is a layered or multi-tiered approach. There's multiple components, but transfer really focuses on those relationships that you may have with outside entities, third parties, vendors. So this could be your food service companies, transportation companies. We'll share some more examples as we go through. But the overall idea is to minimize the exposure to unnecessary risks by shifting it to the responsible parties, in this case, the vendors. So why would you want to utilize risk transfer? Again, when your school hires a third party, you want the liability associated with their operations to remain with them. And why is that? Well, because they are going to be the parties that have the most control over the operations and associated risks. So to give you just one quick example, I can think of an incident we had at one of our schools where the food service provider, happened to be ravioli day, and they kind of weren't managing the temperature of the ravioli. It was too hot, and in serving it to one of the students, that ravioli sauce spilled on their arm and caused, I think it might have been third-degree burns. So when you have a claim or an incident like that, you want there to be mechanisms in place that will sort of clearly outline who's going to be the responsible party, namely whose insurance provider is going to be the one to pay for the claim. Just some other quick examples, again, transportation, building maintenance, janitorial services, even when other parties might be leasing your space. Really, the goal of this is to not have your insurance pay for a loss that is outside of your control. You pay a lot for your insurance, it's part of your budget. You don't want to just give it away to anyone. So as far as executing the risk transfer, as I mentioned before, it's really most effective as a layered approach. So these are the three main components that we'll jump into. You've got hold harmless and indemnification language in agreements and contracts, certificates of insurance, as well as the all-important additional insured status. So I wanted to start with the contracts and agreements piece because it really is the most important. It's the most critical tool in this risk transfer process. If you have a properly worded contract, it really provides the most comprehensive protection. And so what should these contracts include? Insurance requirements, right? So what lines of coverage do you want your vendor to have? What should those limits be? It's also an opportunity for you to clearly specify that you want to be named as an additional insured. Contracts are also a useful tool in outlining the responsibilities of each party. In other words, what is the vendor responsible for doing versus what is the school responsible for doing? A good contract will also include hold harmless and indemnification language in favor of the school. To put this simply, it's basically language that will stipulate that the vendor will indemnify the party that might be injured or property damage, and the school wouldn't have to. And in other words, they're holding the school harmless. The other component is the certificate of insurance, and hopefully you guys have seen these before. It's commonly known as a COI for short, but it's basically a form that is issued by an insurer or their authorized representative and provides evidence that a company carries insurance. It's the customary method of showing that the vendor providing services has met their insurance requirements. It also summarizes the essential terms, conditions, and duration of the specified policy at the time the certificate was prepared. So we'll dive into what all these sections mean and why they're important. First, I'll just highlight the importance of why and how you would want to use these certificates of insurance. Ideally, you're going to want to require the COI before the commencement of any work or events or any other types of services. It's not something that you want to get after the fact. It's also a tool. It can help you discover whether or not your vendors or other third parties have met their insurance requirements, including maintaining adequate limits. It's also a way to confirm that you were named as an additional insured, and I'll show you how to check for that. Now, if you don't have a COI or you find out that your vendor doesn't have coverage, there is a strong chance, high probability that the school may have to pay for any losses, whether it's bodily injury or property damage, out of the vendor's actions from their own liability policy, which is certainly something that you would want to try to avoid. So as we take a look at the COI, like I typically tell people, I know there's a lot going on, so I'll break each section down and let you know which are the most important. But first, we've got to look at the fine print. What the fine print basically says is that the certificate of insurance is not a contract. It's definitely not a substitute for a contract. All it does is provide a snapshot of the insurance types and coverage that a vendor is maintaining at a given point in time. It's basically for informational purposes only, but it's still important, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. But in taking a look at the certificate itself, I'll break down some of the sections here. So upper left corner, there's a section labeled producer. This is basically your vendor's insurance provider. They are the ones that place coverage for the vendor. They also create, order, and send out these certificates of insurance. The next section is the insured section. So here you're going to want to check to make sure that the vendor's legal name is represented on the certificate. So if the vendor tells you their name is one thing and then you get the certificate of insurance and it's a completely different name, you're going to want to get with that vendor to help clarify or resolve whatever the issue may be. Down towards the bottom, there is a description of operations section. This typically is where the operations that the vendor is providing will be specified. It might also speak to specific locations where the services will be provided and any other special provisions that may apply. It will typically say something like what's shown on the screen here. I know the print is a bit small, so I'll read it for you. Certificate holder is included as an additional insured. Bottom left corner, but also very important, is certificate holder. This is where you're going to want to check for the school's legal name and address. So always check to confirm that. Other sections on here, you've got type of insurance. And so you're going to want to check here for what policies does the vendor have in place. Ideally, they're going to have general liability insurance coverage. If they are operating vehicles on your premises, and probably even more important, if it's a transportation company that's going to be transporting your students and staff, you're going to want to make sure they have automobile liability coverage as well. And pretty much all of these vendors have employees, so you're going to want to ensure that they have workers' compensation coverage as well. The next section shows the effective dates for each policy that they have. Ideally, you're going to want to make sure that these dates coincide with any active contracts or operations you may have with the vendor. So to just give you a quick example, if it shows that the policy expires in May of 2022, but you're going to be working with them through July, you're going to want to make sure that before May comes that you get a new certificate showing the renewal dates or the dates for the following policy year. The next section on the right-hand side are where the limits are outlined, and this is the amount of coverage that each policy the vendor is maintaining has. So this should match your insurance requirements. So the next question is, well, what should your insurance requirements be? The industry best practice is typically $1 million per occurrence and $2 million in aggregate. If they're maintaining higher limits, that's awesome. However, if those limits may be lower, it might be a good opportunity to reevaluate vendor selection. Maybe there's another vendor out there that has higher limits, and you might want to consider going with them instead. The left-hand side, there is an insured letter box, and basically, it is important, but not as important as the other boxes. There are letters here that correspond with letters in the upper right corner that basically indicate which actual insurance carrier is providing each line of coverage. Lastly, bottom right corner, you're going to see the language here is pretty much the same on all certificates, but it basically outlines the cancellation requirements. So just for your guys' information, it's typically the responsibility of the agent or broker that is working with the vendor to notify the insured of any cancellation of coverage, and then it becomes the vendor's responsibility to notify you guys if the coverage has been canceled as well. So the ball is in their court with regard to that. The other key component, you may have heard of this, but it's something that we explain to our charter schools just because we've had claims in the past where this comes into play, and I'll share an example here in a little bit. But additional insured status is basically, it allows certain rights to be conferred upon you as an additional insured status holder, certain rights which would include the vendor's policy paying for claims that might arise as a result of their operations. This is something you definitely want to check for, and I'll share this example to just add some context to why this is so important. So this is loosely based on an actual incident that happened at one of our schools. There's a charter school, we'll just call it ABC Great Charter, that decided to have a spirit day and hired an event coordinator called Terrific Event Coordinators to come on site and manage the event. They had a variety of different activities. One of the most popular was sumo wrestling with these inflatable sumo costumes, similar to what you see in the photo there. There was one student, we'll call her Sally. She was wrestling with her classmates. She unfortunately fell backwards and hit her head, and alleged injuries due to, or rather her parents, alleged injuries due to negligent supervision by the vendor. They later filed suit, and with most suits, almost every party that could be named is named. So needless to say, they named both the charter school and the vendor in the lawsuit that ultimately resulted in defense costs of over $100,000, and the claim ultimately settled for about $160,000. So the next question becomes, in these situations, whose insurance is primarily responsible for defending and handling the claim? So your first thought is, obviously, it's going to be the vendor's policy. They were the ones at fault, but it's not always that black and white, unfortunately. The answer should be straightforward, however. If there is an agreement in place that includes the requirement for the vendor to name, or ABC to name, or sorry, Terrific to name the school as an additional insured, as well as that COI properly reflecting additional insured status provided to the school. Without this, the burden may fall on the charter school. So those defense costs that are over $100,000, it's highly likely that a good chunk of that was spent in just getting rid of the ambiguity, right? So there's no contract in place. It was unclear whose policy would be the first to respond. If you have these measures in place, it makes it easier for your insurance carrier to what's called tendering the claim to the vendor's policy, which is basically just a transference of the claim to have the vendor's policy respond. So when you get the COIs, how do you confirm that you have been named as an additional insured? Again, the COI by itself, it isn't a contract, it isn't an endorsement to the insurance policy, but it's just evidence, and really it's the best that you can get within reason. So we've highlighted a box on the left-hand side here. It says additional insured, it's abbreviated there. What you're going to want to look for is that there is a Y. I've seen sometimes an X in this box next to the general liability column. And the description of operations section below will also typically indicate that the certificate holder is included as an additional insured. Now, just going back to an earlier example, if this is a transportation company, for instance, and they're going to be using buses or other vehicles to transport your students, you're going to want to make sure that you're also an additional insured on the automobile liability exposure, because that's going to be the line of coverage where most of this exposure is. Before we get a little bit closer to the end, I wanted to highlight some of the limitations associated with these COIs. So first and foremost, again, we started with contracts because they're the most important. Now, if you're in a situation where you have signed the vendor's contract, and that contract includes language where they, the vendor, are requiring you to add them as an additional insured, then it doesn't matter if their COI shows you as an additional insured, because the contract is a legal document. The COI is not a legal document. The contract will always supersede the COI. The other limitation is that the COI, again, is just a snapshot, so it only confirms that coverage was in place at the time it was created. Furthermore, there isn't necessarily a guarantee that the coverage has not been canceled, during the time they're working with you, or that there was another claim that exhausted the limits. There are some background underwriting procedures that are typically completed for you to be an additional insured. There's also, it's difficult to guarantee that nothing else could have happened to reduce or exclude coverage on the vendor's policy. So I totally get that there's a lot on this slide and it could be confusing at first. And this is really where it's best to rely on your insurance agent. We have our charter schools reach out to us quite often to help them navigate some of the nuances and gray areas when it comes to these things. So, if you're one of our members, please do not hesitate to reach out. We review COIs and contracts from an insurance perspective all the time. So definitely take advantage of that. And then I think that's it for the COI piece. The next section, we were just going to kind of go over some of the questions. And Miss Mary, did we get any questions that came through?
Yes, we have some questions here. All right, so let's jump right into it. The first one is, what happens if we get a request from the vendor asking the school to name them as additional insured?
So I would say that is a little bit more rare, but it has happened in the past. You would typically see that if you're in, let's say, like a landlord-tenant relationship, if you, the school, are leasing the premises from somebody else, or maybe you're renting space somewhere else for a particular event, that's where we would see that. But if you're running into a situation where a contractor or bounce house vendor wants them to name you as an additional insured, you might want to consult us or your agent, because that shouldn't really be the case. And I'll explain a little bit why. So for those of you who may not know, charter schools and public entities within the state of Florida benefit from something called sovereign immunity protection. And it's basically a statute that limits the amount of total claims costs that can be provided to a claimant or someone who were to file suit against a public entity. Private entities do not have that benefit. That being said, if you were to name a private entity as an additional insured, for some reason, your total claims cost could be a lot higher than if it was another public entity. And as you can imagine, that is something that you would definitely want to avoid.
Okay, that was a great question. I see another one here. I didn't see what I usually see on the COIs received, which is that the school is additional insured when required by contract. I was wondering, what does that mean?
So that's a good one, and we have seen that quite a bit. Perhaps you guys have too. So with a lot of vendors, the policy that they have would have something called a blanket endorsement, not to get too technical, but this endorsement basically says that the vendor can only name people they're working with as an additional insured if there is a contract requiring it. That being said, going back to what we started off with, the contracts, especially if you see this, you're going to want to make sure that you have a contract in place that has that requirement for the vendor to name you as an additional insured, because in the absence of a contract or a contract that doesn't have this requirement, you may not be named as an additional insured, particularly if there were to be some sort of an incident or a claim.
Okay, so we're getting close to noon, but I think we have time for one more. What about workers' compensation? Should we ask the vendors to name the school as additional insured under workers' compensation? That's a great question.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So you actually cannot be named as an additional insured on a workers' compensation policy, because the intention of a workers' compensation policy is not to provide coverage for liability. It's really just to pay for employee injuries. But I'm glad that this was brought up, because when you are looking at these COIs and selecting vendors, you are going to want to confirm that they have workers' compensation coverage in place, because if they are working on your school premises and they become injured, that workers' comp policy should be the first to respond to their injury. If for some reason they don't have workers' comp, there is a chance that, well, one, they could file a claim against your GL policy or file suit, because that's, we're in a litigious society, and you wouldn't want your liability policy to have to respond to that claim. So if you ever encounter a vendor that is not maintaining workers' comp coverage, that's a hard pass. Definitely move on to another option.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. That's all the time we have for today. But if we didn't get to your question, I have some more questions here. If we didn't get to your question, please feel free to reach out. Here is our contact information on the next slide. So you can give us a call or shoot us an email to either member of the team, Brent, myself, Chelsea, or Ryan, and we'll be happy to either schedule some time to talk, or we'll answer your questions as soon as we can. As mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and it's going to be posted in our YouTube channel. Afterwards, we're going to send you an email with a link to that posting, and also with a handout of some of the things that we've mentioned here, what to look for in a certificate of insurance, and those marks of specifically each section. So you can use that as a cheat sheet, so to speak. And again, feel free to send that to anyone in your staff that you may think that can benefit from that. Also, if you have any questions about your own program, or if you're losing sleep over something, if you lose sleep tonight, probably we did a good job pointing out some of the things that you should look out for to protect your schools. We're here to help anytime. Just give us a call, reach out, and we'll look at whatever it is that you need and give you our feedback. Again, this is all for today. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope we provided you some valuable information, and we hope to see you again soon in our next webinar. Until then, have a great rest of your day and great weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.